Hello and welcome to Creative Solutions for a New World Climate and Artists series. I'm Frances Littman, your host. I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this region and First Nations worldwide. For thousands of years, the abundance that these lands and waters provide us to live, work, and play is due to the reciprocal relationships by which Coast Salish and the world's first people have lived and live today. This weekly Climate and Artists webinar series is presented by the Creatively United for the Planet nonprofit society in partnership with John O'Riordan of the Gail O'Riordan Climate and the Arts Legacy Series and the Ecoforestry Institute Society. John O'Riordan is a former Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Sustainable Resource Management. He is actively dedicated to protecting and preserving forests. Welcome, John. Would you like to introduce Kathleen Code, our Ecoforestry Institute Society partner?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that, Frances. Yes, Kathy is the Vice Chair and Communications Director for the Ecoforestry Society. And as you saw on the screen, it's one of our sponsors. So it's a special pleasure, Kathy, to introduce you in this presentation. You've made a number of presentations in the past in our Climate and Artists series, but I see that today you're renewing your call for a new forest framework because we have a new government and we have a unique opportunity to make a real difference to the way we practice forests in our BC. So over to you to start the presentation.
Thank you for that introduction, Jonathan, and thank you, Frances, for this series. So first of all, we'd like to start off by acknowledging with respect and appreciation the Snuneymuxw and Chemainus Coast Salish peoples within whose traditional territories Wildwood is situated and whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I'll turn this slide over to you, Jonathan, to speak to.
Yes, we in Creative United and Climates for the Arts are looking through a lens of a carbon neutral world by 2050. So I thought it would be appropriate to see what's involved in having all of our forests, not just in BC, but globally, become a contributor to a carbon neutral world in the next 30 years. So the first item is to protect biodiversity at what we call the natural disturbance level. So it means that the forests replicate what was the original biodiversity characteristics that they inherited from nature. And we need to change a fair bit of that. And the world scientists are calling now for at least 30% of the land base and the water base to be under conservation rules by 2030 and more of that by 2050. So there's a big shift required to move towards a higher and more stable biodiversity state in BC. Secondly, in terms of carbon, forests, deforestation globally accounts for about 14% of the carbon emissions. So in order to be carbon neutral, forests have to net down that 14% over the next 30 years. So that means greatly increasing the capacity of our forests to store carbon and reduce the frequency of forest fires and other sources of carbon by changed forest practices and forest conservation. Third, there's a wide range of employment that can be obtained for a natural forest, much broader than industrial forestry. And Kathy will talk about the range of jobs that are available in BC based on a broadly based, nature-based approach to forests. Fourthly, it's important to understand that the Indigenous peoples around the world have access to about 37% of the natural land base around the world. So in BC, I'm not sure exactly what the percentage, but there's a fair potential of their claims to title on the forested land base, and so forth. Their interests and values have to be respected. And finally, we need to have a forest that is resilient to climate change, because we know that over the next 20 years, no matter what happens, carbon emissions will increase for a while, and that will lead to greater frequency and extent of forest fires, flooding, droughts, and insect infestations. So a biodiverse forest is much more resilient to deal with these changes to the nature, and a less biodiverse one is more likely to have major problems. So we will be able to have a better basis for dealing with climate change over the next 30 years. So that's the lens that we're looking for. Let's see how the new call applies to this lens. Back to you, Kathy.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. And I'd like to actually remind people that this presentation is a follow-up then to the call that we had issued previously with a letter that people were able to send to their elected representatives. And we'd like to thank everybody who participated in that effort. And I think we're living in a world that's a little bit changed now. There's a little more hope, but we still have to keep up the pressure, and there's still lots of work to be done. So going through the agenda, then we'll have a look at the post-election overview and what that means for forests of BC. We'll have a look at what's wrong with the current forest model, look at Indigenous reconciliation, the science, then we'll issue the call, and then we'll talk about next steps.
So Kathy, when we talk about the election, one of the advantages of the BC election is that, as everybody knows, normally the time for an election would have been fall of 2021. The government, for a number of reasons, chose to bring it forward a year. So that means now that they've been re-elected, they have a full 4-year mandate to grapple with and change the way we manage our forests, rather than having it over a 1-year period and having an election call hanging over them. So let's talk about what does that unique opportunity of a majority government and a 4-year mandate mean towards creating this new forest framework.
Yes, and what's happened then with the NDP then during the election is that they committed in their platform then to the 14 recommendations in the Gorley and Merkel report, the Old Growth Strategic Review report. So, I mean, that's very good news for us. They had followed it up though with a deferral plan for old growth that really was not as substantive as it might have been. So unfortunately, that was met with some criticism. But certainly if government tends to stick to its commitment to old growth and to partnerships with a government-to-government relationship with Indigenous peoples, I think those are excellent starting points. What we've seen in the meantime then is a growing chorus of voices, academics, scientists, citizens, nonprofit organizations, communities who all are clamoring for a new framework for our forests. So I think it's timely, the time has come, and we need to continue that momentum.
So Kathy, it's probably useful to let people know who's responsible for what aspects of policy and forest management today in BC.
Yes, and that's a really good point because 95% of BC's timber is publicly owned. That means it's owned and managed by our government on behalf of the public. So government is responsible for legislation, policy, regulations, that sort of thing. And we've seen, though, that it's been rooted in the model, then the current model of clear cutting and silviculture that replaces our old growth forests and standing forests then with timber plantations, tree plantations. So this is a long-standing policy that has never been really questioned and really has little scientific evidence to support it. The forest harvesting and replanting then have been undertaken by those companies that basically hold the forest tenures of the province. Basically a handful of industrial logging companies then who are responsible for the logging and milling and taking the fiber then to offshore or to the sawmills where it's processed. Regulation and professional reliance. We have an association that accredits registered professional foresters and forest technicians. Again, that is imbued with the current practices of forestry. We do have, I think, about 57 community forests scattered throughout the province. This represents approximately 3% of our forests. I did my thesis in sustainable community forests, so I did a bit of research on this and found that the road to a community forest was very long and arduous. There were many obstacles, it was very expensive, and often it didn't result in land as productive as it might have been. So it has been an ongoing process for communities who wish to steward their own forests. So I think there's much that could be improved in that area. As far as training and research goes, most of our academic institutions then are engaged in and are committed then to the current model of forestry, which again is the clear cutting and the tree plantations. So again, this whole concept of forestry is something that runs right straight through our entire system. We're beginning to find out now that it's a model that we need to change, and we need to change it quickly.
So Kathy, we said at the beginning that this new call for forest management is not really only a BC issue, it's really a global issue. It certainly applies to other jurisdictions in Canada. So I think we should keep our mind open that even though some of the examples you're providing are British Columbians, these principles apply across the country. So with that in mind, tell us what's wrong with the current model. And I would argue that the problems with the current model in BC apply to most other parts of the world, certainly other parts of Canada.
Yeah, I think that's very true, Jonathan, whether it's the Amazon forest or the boreal forests across Canada or BC. I think there's much that needs to be changed if we are to reduce carbon emissions and increase our biodiversity, which, as we know, is on the edge of collapse. But what I've discovered through my research then is that the historical concept of forestry came with the settlers as they came across Canada and saw the great forest of BC, and their immediate conclusion was that nature had really made a mess of things. You know, there was all this understory and trees everywhere and logs everywhere and dead trees lying around, and they didn't really understand the concept of the forest, not as the Indigenous peoples of the time certainly understood it. So the settlers decided it was their business, their job then to tidy things up and to reform forests then into manageable landscapes where they could make commercially available timber more easily accessible, and that they would grow it in neat straight rows and none of this understory business. And they could control then the crops, which is what they were, that they were going to grow in place of these functioning ecosystems. So when we look at the science of clear cutting, well, there is no science of clear cutting. It's simply a practice that was adopted and has been used over the decades then to do the work as efficiently and effectively and at the least cost as possible. And it is a very effective way for that. And you know, why wouldn't companies do that? I mean, that they're in the business to make money. They're not in the business to, you know, look at the science of it. So, and the real motivation though is that the real money is in the old growth. You know, as the old growth dwindles, and we've discovered now it's down to a mere fraction of what it used to be. Some of these old trees now are worth a great deal of money. For instance, an ancient yellow cedar can be worth as much as $50,000. And we're hearing stories now of people going into the forest and removing these trees and making off with them. And there doesn't seem to be any monitoring to prevent that kind of action. But there is money to be made, but at what cost? Because the money made now means that the destruction of our forests results in less biodiversity, less resilience to climate change. And the result is that we don't really know what are all the services and benefits and goods that are offered by a fully functioning ecosystem. And that's something that there is beginning to be research in that area, but we need to know more. As it stands, jobs and revenue in the current model are on the decline. You know, BC's communities have faced boom and bust momentum over the years, and it's been really disastrous on their communities, very hard on them. So we need to find a way then to develop systems that allow us to live in greater harmony with our forests and develop jobs and revenue then that can be more thoroughly shared with the community. And of course, the loss of our ecosystems and our old growth means that there's a loss of resilience in reference to climate change. And this is something that knows no boundaries. This is something that's happening all over the world. We have less ability to store carbon, less ability to purify the air, the water. There's so much that our forests do for us. And we really need, I think, to put ourselves back into contact with the forest and acquaint ourselves with what a forest actually does for us.
I think a good example of the effects of climate on boom and bust forestry was the beetle kill in the central interior of BC. Because of the warming winters, there was no beetle kill universally across these infested forests. And so the beetles tended to grow way beyond their natural boundaries. And this caused the government to try to capture the forest values by massively logging the diseased beetle trees before they were non-marketable, and changed the ecology of the watersheds and the whole structure of the economy. So now we're in a bust cycle that all these trees have gone through the mills. So this is a kind of switch that we have to have when we come to a more ecologically based forestry. So let's talk about some of the policy reviews, because the most recent old growth study is by no means the first of what's been going on over the last 30 years in BC. So maybe I'll start, Kathy, with talking about the study in 1992, because I was involved in government then, and in 1992, the NDP government of the day decided that they were concerned about level of clear cutting. There was a lot of public unrest in forestry communities because of the effects of clear cutting, and the environmental groups were engaging with the market to try and reduce the market share of companies that were having an excessive level of clear cut. So the government of the day developed an old growth strategy under the various scientific reviews in the early 90s. And that led to the creation of the Forest Practices Code, which was the first attempt at ecological-based forestry in BC, and that was followed later by the Forest and Range Practices Act. The main thing I want to emphasize here, Kathy, before we carry on, is that in every case of the legislation, any move towards biodiversity and conservation was always subject to an overarching principle that there would be no impact on the annual allowable cut. So that is a huge constraint, and it meant that the ability to move towards a more ecological-based forests was always subject to an economic override. I mean, we're going to talk about that in the new forest framework later in this presentation. So I'll let you walk through some of the other gold growth reviews in the last couple of decades.
Yes, and the current reports have made it clear that government has known about this issue for at least the past 30 years, and they have known that internally. For instance, the Forest Practices Board has produced reports providing information to government in which they might consider a new model and they might consider more innovation. The same with Auditor General reports and recommendations. Then the Auditor General criticized the government for not being more innovative in its approach to forestry, and while the government, they applauded government for at least being responsible for implementing some of the changes that were requested, that they hadn't completely implemented them. So there was some criticism on that. So this is information that government has known over time, and so it now brings us to this crisis point, as pointed out by Dr. Rachel Holt and Dr. Karen Price, and the authors of the Old Growth Strategic Review. Both of them say, here we are now at this point in time where we have an absolute need then to actually do some action on an eco-forestry based forestry model. The Last Stand for Biodiversity, I thought, was an excellent study then of what our old growth forests consist of. And it shows that a good 80% of it is non-productive old growth forest. There's only 20% of it, of the old growth forest, that is actually what we consider, the magnificent stands of large trees, mostly on the south coast here. And this is where, in our old growth forests, this is where our greatest biodiversity exists then, in terms of plants, wildlife, all of the activity that goes on underground. I'm sure people have heard of Dr. Suzanne Simard and her work done with tree communications and how that whole underground web works. You don't find that in tree plantations. The Old Growth Strategic Review Report came with 14 recommendations. The two most important then is that they recommended a deferral on old growth cutting, and also emphasize the importance of government to government partnership with the First Nations. The difference between the two reports is that the Holt report recommends a full moratorium now on old growth, and that's a view that we tend to agree with. We believe that the science is there, that we need to have a moratorium on the last remaining old growth stands. Some of the more interesting contemporary literature includes Dave Broadland's article in Focus magazine. He was the fellow that did the arduous research of the government's public accounts to have a look at the revenue and expenses related to forestry. And his conclusion was that forestry doesn't pay the bill, folks. And in fact, that taxpayers are subsidizing the forest industry to the tune of $1 million a day. Well, that's pretty huge, especially when we are always told that there is revenue coming in through the payment of stumpage. But when you look at stumpage is what remains left over when the industry then has paid for the roads, has paid for all of their costs then involved in their work in clear cutting and access to those forests. So that doesn't leave much in terms of actual stumpage payment revenue that comes back to government and the taxpayers. We've now seen a statement from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs about their support for a moratorium on old growth cutting. And just yesterday, the First Nations Forestry Council report came out, again, with basically the same conclusion. So we have this growing chorus of voices now, based on science, based on fact, and the evidence that it's there, that something has got to change, that we need to develop a whole new concept from the ground up. So that brings us then to the call for a new forest framework. And it is now time for citizens and taxpayers to demand more from their government when it comes to our precious and public forest resource. And it's a call then from an extractive and destructive model to one that respects healthy ecosystems, is home to biodiversity, benefits communities, and spans generations. So the call for a new forest framework, as I mentioned, requires that we build a new model from the ground up. I think we have to base our new model then on values and rationale, that we have to view forests as holistic entities, not just sources of standing fiber. There is so much that exists in a forest. I know that I've done workshops with First Nations elders and walked 20 feet into the forest and spent an hour there learning about all of the uses for the plants just contained within that one area, in terms of roots, in terms of berries, in terms of leaves, and their relationship with the animals and the seasonal changes. There is so much that we can learn from our Indigenous peoples, and we need to look at the complexity of a forest and how it works, not just in its separate beings, but as how it works as a complete system. We need to restructure the ties between government, industry, training, accreditation, and monitoring institutions. From what I've learned from my work with looking at forest management systems related to tree forest licenses, it appears that there's really little monitoring. Once an industrial logging company has permission from government to harvest, according to the forest management plan that they've submitted, there is really little monitoring that goes on after that. That really needs to be changed. We need to, in fact, revamp the whole tenure system. There's, as I mentioned, only about a handful of the big industrial logging companies and that are responsible for managing our forests. The only publicly accessible documents then available to the public include their forest management plan and the site plan. The site plan is available only at their office, viewable upon appointment, and not likely that they will allow you to copy it or photograph it. So, that kind of public access isn't really as honest as it might be. We have to change from an allowable cut proposition to a cut then that works within the ecological parameters of the forest. This is something that we've done since 1945 at Wildwood, and it's worked wonderfully well. We still have a fully intact functioning forest, and we have a forest that has been harvested since that time, probably has more timber now than when Merv Wilkinson started out in 1945. We also need to increase our opportunities for value-added products at the end of the process so that we stop the offshore raw log exports and that we allow communities more access then to develop their own products.
So Kathy, can I make a quick interjection here, because we actually have one forest in British Columbia which follows the principles that you're calling for in terms of a new forest framework, and that's the Central and North Coast in Haida Gwaii of BC, where over the last 2 decades we've shifted to a conservation-based forest. It's way more than 30% is protected from logging. There was a huge new approach to science that was funded by industry, government, and First Nations to look at the holistic approach to forest management rather than fiber cutting. And there's a fund that's in place now to help use the money that we're getting from carbon sequestration to advance a wide range of jobs, ecotourism, fisheries, forest-based jobs for First Nations in a much more productive way than was the case before. So we have the elements of this, but one of the things that we've noted is that there needs to be a constant overview of what's going on, because there is a tendency to slip back to the old ways of doing forestry unless there's some independent monitoring on the watersheds that keep everybody honest to the principles set out in that Green Bay Rainforest Agreement. So let's carry on for some of these shifts that you want to see, not only on the Great Bay Rainforest, but across Canada, certainly across BC.
Yes, thank you for that, Jonathan. And certainly your points about monitoring and professional reliance are key, because if nobody's keeping an eye on how the forest is actually being managed on the ground, that leaves it wide open for any practice to take place. So in the call for a new forest framework then is what we're looking for are a number of shifts then. A shift from industrial logging to one that's ecologically based and working within those parameters of the ecology. Now there's a lot of forest in BC now that is now timber plantations, tree plantations. I understand that a lot of those are hitting, the 50 to 70 year age range. Still not quite big enough to cut. But coupled then with the beetle infestation that Jonathan mentioned previously, I mean, that has led to a shortage of fiber then from an industrial logging perception. So obviously then old growth becomes very attractive, but we need to make sure then that those those areas are especially protected because those are the areas that contain the biodiversity, the flora, the fauna, all the things that we treasure then within an ecology. The loss of biodiversity, I mean, it's been reported internationally that the loss of biodiversity has been huge across the globe in recent years, and we need practices that stop this. We need to recognize that. Increased carbon emissions, as Jonathan had previously mentioned, we need to get those down to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And forests are quite capable of doing that. And especially the old growth forests are huge carbon sinks. And so we have to allow them to do their job. It's been proven that the younger forests, the plantations forests, don't have quite the same power when it comes to absorbing carbon. So we need to recognize that and realize that, you know, if we continue to pollute our world, there's not going to be much left. The boom and bust employment in communities, leading to diversified and resilient communities. You know, in my previous employment as an economic development policy analyst with government, I personally witnessed several of our small communities making great efforts to diversify their economy from a single resource town, such as forestry, and turning themselves into something that's far more diversified and far more able to generate different revenues of different streams of revenue. We've had such a poor engagement with Indigenous peoples. UNDRIP makes it quite clear that that's not an acceptable situation. And the NDP government now has committed to a government-to-government decision-making process with Indigenous peoples. So we certainly look forward to that. And the low resilience to climate, high resilience to climate change. As I mentioned before, the net zero, there's so much in an ecologically based forest that allows us, that leads to the longevity of these forests, you know, the moisture retention, that leads to good hydrological systems. There's the nutrients in the soil, the many plants and wildlife. You know, these are things that are really essential then for us to continue in the future. So yeah, the thing that I just wanted to emphasize here was that nature got it right in the first place. And, you know, nature knows what it's doing in terms of developing systems that work on the ground and systems that work for us and for the rest of nature. And I think it's an important key element that we believe that we are a part of nature, not apart from it. Just speak here quickly to the Indigenous relationship with the land and the old growth. There is a deep spiritual and cultural relationship that our Indigenous peoples have. They regard the forest as their relations, and they have a tremendous wealth of traditional ecological knowledge. We must start respecting their rights under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and they are the ones then who can plan for the long term, for the 250 years or 7 generations planning. That's really key if we want to keep ourselves going in the right direction. So the next steps then.
Right. Can we wrap up with these next steps, Kathy? And then we've got time for questions and we can close off.
Sure. And I think we've seen a lot of these repeated already. So, you know, the government approved the policy shift that they've committed to, the immediate moratorium on old growth logging, consultation with stakeholders, and new jobs and revenue generation model. We're not saying don't cut the forest. We're saying cut in a responsible manner and within the boundaries of these functioning ecosystems, and that we would like it done in a timely manner. And just to let you know then about the role of the Ecoforestry Institute. We are the owners and trustees of Wildwood, and we're following in Merv Wilkinson's legacy. And we have an extensive ecoforestry management plan, and we've fit our model into Kate Rayworth's donut economics model. and how we operate and manage wildwood. So if anybody has questions on that, we'd love to hear from you. So what can you do? Hold government accountable for these election promises. We can't afford to have deferral plans that have no substance to them. I think we have a province-wide solid basis of knowledge of academics and scientists and people who really can examine processes and policy that come out of government, so we know that they can be really effective on the ground. I think it's up to us then to know our forest. What do you have around you? What's in it? Again, develop those partnerships with Indigenous peoples and think about how we might operate then in terms of marrying Western science with traditional ecological knowledge. I mean, what a powerful combination that is. And we can learn community stories like Wildwood and the Shawnigan Basin Society. And as a personal favor, I would ask if you're able to go out into the forest this afternoon, just go out and take a look around and see it and smell the forest and feel it and really try to understand what it is that you're experiencing, because it really does have a positive effect. So we need the framework now. There is no room for delay, and we have to build it on values, principles, sound science, and Indigenous partnerships. We have the means, the knowledge, and all we need is the political will. We're a truly supernatural place, and we'd like to keep it that way. And I'd like to just give a shout out to all the forest and land defenders out there, who are protecting your corners of the province in terms of land and forest, and at great expense, time, and effort sometimes. So thank you for that. And so questions, comments, ideas, you can always reach us through the Ecoforestry Institute Society. Send us your questions or have a look at our website. And here's one of the iconic photographs of Wildwood. Thank you.
Kathy. Very, very good. I just wanted to close with one comment about the government's statement during the election. It said it would recommend the support of the old growth strategy that was prepared for them. And there's two key recommendations that is important that we hold them accountable for. One is that they would engage in government to government, i.e. First Nation, Indigenous people and government consultation supported by stakeholders. But the most important recommendation was that they would move towards a biodiversity and conservation-based set of values over economic values. So that's a huge shift from what I was talking about earlier, where all of the legislation to date has been subject to not reducing economic value of the forest. Now there's a call, and the government is on record of supporting it, that conservation and biology and biodiversity is a more important set of values than economic opportunities. So thank you, Kathy. Over to you, Frances.
Wow, thank you. What an insightful and thought-provoking program. So there are a number of questions, and we'll endeavor to get to them all. This one's from Rod. He said he's been aware that forests have been poorly managed for at least 50 years. And you said that a model of sustainable forest needs to be developed. Why is there no model really to guide us yet?
Oh, but there is. I mean, we do have some successful examples. I mean, Wildwood is a successful example of ecoforestry management. And I think we're one of the few working demonstration forests on the west coast of North America. So, I mean, we are few and far between. And Jonathan mentioned the Haida Gwaii folks as well. So, I mean, there are examples, and I think one of the things that I'd like to do is develop a resources list of, some of these success stories, because the models exist, the steps exist. Why reinvent the wheel every time? Obviously, there are going to be, site-specific issues for each and every community. I believe that forestry should be community-driven. So, and those communities are the best people then who, to decide what's best for their forest and what's best for their community. So there are models, and we can certainly share that with you.
Great. And this one from Lynn. How can we read the report on BC's old growth forest? Where do you find that?
Oh, it's online. I don't know if Francis, if you can, I can send you the link, and if you want to send it out, then that
Sure.
would.
We'll do that with the video. When we post the video on the website, we'll put
Yeah.
some of these links. How about that?
Yeah.
Okay, and Jason asks, is there a consensus on the definition of an old growth forest? Forests are a cyclical ecosystem. What happens to the stands of, quote, old growth when they transition to young forests in your protection scheme?
Well, they never transition. They're always ongoing, right? Because they follow that full cycle of life and death on an ongoing basis. So there should never be like all of a sudden the appearance of a young forest, because it's following the nature's way of life and death and renewal through the life and death cycle.
There is actually not a universal definition of old growth, and one of the calls for in the reports that has been supported in principle by the new government is to create the science needed to once and all establish what is old growth and how can it be best protected.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and that reminds me that the Holt and Price report was a very detailed look at our old growth systems and how they differ. So I would really highly recommend that you read that report. And again, I'll send that link to Frances and she can send that out.
Excellent, thank you. And Carolyn says, is the proposed moratorium date too late? She fears that the industry is cutting the oldest and the biggest trees as fast as they can before the moratorium is implemented.
Yeah, and that's certainly an issue. And I think probably the industrial logging companies know this, and that's why they're cutting as fast as they can. You see the trucks coming out of Lake Cowichan there, and they're just filled with these big trees. So yeah, I mean, but it's up to us to try and save what we can.
Mm-hmm.
But Francis, on that, the government commission report pointed out that if we carry on logging old growth as we've been doing for the last decade, that within a decade, the entire biodiversity of old growth will be at full risk. There won't be any protected areas outside parks and formerly conservation areas. So time is very much of the essence to protect what's left of the valuable old growth.
Absolutely. Victor asks, 1 million a day in funding to the forest industry. Do you have a source for this figure? Is that something we can post later, Kathy?
Yeah, again, that's Dave Broadland's research in his article called Forestry Doesn't Pay the Bill, folks. So I can send that link along too. It's a very well researched article.
Excellent. And anonymous attendee, can biodiversity be introduced into plantations?
Well, plantations are planted specifically to grow commercially viable trees such as cedar and fir, whatever is desired at the time. And the job of the logging the timber company then is to weed out those pesky maples and alders and all the rest of that growth. So it's not encouraged in that model. So it's a model that has to be changed.
Mm-hmm. And Colin asks, what do you believe to be the best way to create a province-wide monitoring system for public lands?
A monitoring system?
Mm-hmm.
Again, that has to come from perhaps an arm's length association sponsored by government. I think it has to be independent of the industry. It has to be independent of influences, and it has to have, a solid foundation on what are best practices and maintaining the goals and values of the new model.
And Francis, further on that, one of the keys to independent monitoring is the use of Indigenous peoples as monitors, because they know the land. Mm-hmm. And in the Central Coast, they were supposed to be funded by the carbon credits that were created by the conservation of forests. But as you know, the carbon market is pretty weak right now. And in our earlier presentation on the Great Bear Rainforest, we found out that the monitors don't have the funds, so we don't have independent First Nations monitoring at this stage, but that is part of the solution.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Stephanie adds to that, conservation covenants include annual monitoring by a third party, so that just supports what you're saying there. And Victor asks, what can people do for forest protection besides joining the old growth blockade?
Well, I think you want to know what the forests are in your community. I think you want to become very familiar with them. You know what is going on with your forest. You can organize within your community, and we've seen many communities do that. 6 Mountains then in North Cowichan, they've done an amazing job then in pushing back against local government's plans for their mountains, for their forests, actually. So yeah, I think more and more as time goes on, the communities are taking things into their own hands. So it's a matter of knowing what's going on around you.
Mm-hmm.
For France, again, this is a unique opportunity created by a majority government, because they're committed to a full consultative process to take this shift from industrial-based logging to one that's more nature-based. And so communities will be engaged in that conversation over the next 6 months or so. People should start to feel, look at what's going on in their communities and how they can get involved. This is a big series of consultations that will start to take place over the next the early part of 2021.
Right. Okay. And of course, this is the million-dollar question. Will the NDP keep their promises to protect old growth ecosystems?
Of course.
Well, well, I think there's enough people out there now who are watching and, have the knowledge, to critique any policies and ideas that come out from the NDP. So, when the deferral plan came out, people were onto that right away. Several groups parsed that out and decided and discovered that it was not as substantive as it should have been. So I think if the NDP are sincere and honest, they will be very aware of that there are many of us out here who are watching.
Mm-hmm. And we must be very vigilant. So Deanna made a very good comment here. She said using old growth needs to be seen as just as deplorable as harvesting elephant or rhino tusks.
Oh, that's very true. In fact, I believe the Holtz and Prince report calls our old growth cedars the White Rhino because they are so increasingly rare, and deserve the same protection.
Mm-hmm. And Lynn says, asks, are there any opportunities to learn from the First Nations about the forests? Like where can one go?
Yeah, certainly the Ecoforestry Institute at Wildwood, we are looking to provide those opportunities. And there are occasionally, community workshops that come along, that sort of thing. It pays to watch online for those things. But I've attended some great workshops and with First Nations elders going through the forest, and it's phenomenal what you can learn in just an hour or two.
Right. Jenica has a comment here. I have heard that Roundup is a glyphosate, and it's being used to eliminate maples and alders in forests near Cowichan that are killing bees. How can we stop that?
Yeah, it's an accepted practice, unfortunately. So again, that has to be part of the new model of forestry, is that we do not introduce those types of chemicals into the environment, and that we let Mother Nature do her work. When you look at maple trees, I mean, it's a beautiful wood, and maples offer so much in terms of food and shade and habitat. So that practice is pretty dismal.
Is it ever? Holy. Vic says, my MLA says they are not hearing from their constituents about this. So he's stressing people contact your MLA. And yeah,
yes, yeah,
very important. Take advantage of the letter that is on Creatively United calling for the new forest framework. If you haven't signed that yet, we've even provided the email addresses to make that super easy for you. So Lorna asks, well, what is the feeling from the NDP? Do you really think they're ready or interested in the new framework?
Well, they've committed to it publicly, during the election. So I think we have to take them at their word and hope for the best, but let them know that we are, monitoring the results.
Mm-hmm. And Deanna asks, is there any work being done to change people's attitude regarding the value of old growth? If a tree is worth 50K, then there must be a high demand for these trees. How do we make people aware or change their values? This should be seen as a reprehensible purchase. I guess that goes back to logging old growth.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But Francis, on that, there are a number of reports that can be summarized that talk about new values associated with eco-based forest management and so-called eco-services like pollination and protection of fisheries. So they have huge benefits in trillions of dollars when you look at the overall nature of forests, which way outweigh the values associated with industrial logging, 10 or 20-fold. So yeah, that information is available and will be part of the science that's going to have to go forward.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem with, putting a value on things, a dollar value on things, is because, we're trained to look at the dollar value rather than the value of the overall goods and services. So it's a whole shift then in the way we think in our culture, and that's going to be a difficult shift to make.
Another question, how can we help the standoff at Fairy Creek, this precious watershed, those people who are trying to stop clear cutting or precious pristine forest that is in John Horgan's riding at Port Renfrew? Again, I guess that comes back to letting it be known that this is unacceptable, right?
Yeah, and it's supporting those people up there. As there are donation campaigns going on at the moment. Paying a visit, letting them know that you support that. I think there's been hundreds of people now who have been through the camps. And they're determined to stay there. So it's good for them to know that there is public support for this, and it's equally important for government to know that there's support for this.
Right. Okay. And Rod says, follow up to his question earlier, he's been aware of Merv Wilkinson's work for many years, but he never hears it mentioned in the media. So he wonders if the government is even aware of it as a viable model.
Oh, indeed. And we've had many government officials up to Wildwood and toured them around the property, and we've spoken to them of our model and how we use the Wildwood model then to generate jobs, not only for a faller, a logger, a miller, but for naturalists, botanists, ethnobotanists, for subject matter experts, those people who talk about bats or bees or lichen. There's any number of experts then who can be engaged, in a forestry world then that expands on just, more than just jobs for truckers and loggers.
Right. And David asks, what's the role of urban forests in the new forestry framework?
I think forests are important no matter where you put them, and I would think that they would be especially important in urban areas to combat all that concrete that's busy emitting carbon out there. So if you can plant forests that that shade concrete and add to the purification of the air, I think you can't go wrong.
That's for certain. John, did you want to add to that?
Well, absolutely. The values that we said about mid-century and carbon neutral not only apply to natural forests, but apply to urban forests. So this is a lens, Francis, that we have to look through every time there's a policy shift in local government, whether they're spending on landfill or doing whatever that starts to take away trees. We have to throw this lens back on the table and say, how can you become carbon neutral if you're taking away forests? So forests are a key component of carbon neutrality.
Someone asked if Kathy could just talk about Wildwood's need to purchase an additional 6 acres of old growth and what that role of Wildwood as an umbrella teaching organization for the whole world. Just if you could mention something more about.
Yes, yeah, we have an opportunity, first right of option to buy the adjoining 6 acres of old growth, prime, pristine old growth forest that's next to Wildwood. It used to belong to Wildwood, but Merv gave half of the property to his son at one point, who turned around and sold it. So we're trying to buy this piece back, and we do pride ourselves in our ability then to share our story with the world and to welcome all to come and tour Wildwood, to provide opportunities, learning opportunities. If you have a special area of expertise, we would love you to come and present. We also focus on school children. We work with School District 68 then to provide classes, outdoor learning experiences for children. We're working with our Indigenous partners then to provide language opportunities and opportunities to really learn about their ecological knowledge of the forest. So we have many opportunities that we're looking forward to.
Yes. And William says, wood is a very benign building material compared to concrete and steel. Where can we get the volume of wood that should be used, that we could use? And I would just like to jump in on this one and say we have done a video on one of the world's first homes in East Sioux Park that uses a completely carbon-free product, that the carbon sequestration starts in the field, as it's a hemp and limecrete product. And those kind of products do exist, but I'll let you jump in, Kathy, and then I'm going to turn it over to John, and the rest of the questions will get answered by us on the website.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, when you look at the raw log exports, the reason they're shipping logs offshore is because they can get double the price for them rather than on the domestic market. So something like that has to shift. The balance has to shift, because if there is a local need for wood product here in the province, then we should be able to supply that instead of shipping it offshore. So again, there's that need for balance.
Thank you. Kathleen, John, amazing. That was extremely thought-provoking. And John, would you like to share the exciting and timely program we have planned for next week, or did you have a few more words that you wanted to finish up for today?
Well, the only word I wanted to say is that I would say the next 4 years provide a unique opportunity to create this new forest framework. If we can't get it done in the next 4 years with a majority government, we're going to lose out completely, and it's going to be too late to make the shift. So we've got to put all hands on deck to make this shift and happen now. So I'm very excited about the opportunities.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would just add, organize in your communities, know what's available and do the organization, because you know best what's available and how you would like that managed.
Okay, John, tell us what's coming up, and because we're down to 1 minute.
Okay, well, so next week, most of you will remember the enthralling presentation by Ms. Rosenstein on the electoral college system in the States and how it can affect the selection of the president. Well, next week, we're going to have a real-time review. What are the results from the election as of noon on Wednesday? How is the electoral college going to materialize? What are the forecasts for a new government? What are the implications on both Canadian and US relations through Tom Axworthy? And what are the implications on the climate by myself? So it's going to be extremely exciting, because it's actually going to unfold in real time. We simply can't prepare for this one. It will be what is exactly happening at noon next Wednesday, 11 o'clock next Wednesday morning. So looking forward to it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, John. And we'll see you next week. Bye for now, everyone.